Hi everyone, John here with Fountain Pen Love, and in this video I want to show you how to do a doodle that I call RADIATE. Now this particular doodle pattern is quite simple to do, so if you have never done a doodle before, I highly recommend starting with this one. It is really just straight lines that all come together. So it's not a difficult pattern to do, but it still looks really cool. That's one of the reasons I like it, is you can do a lot of variations with it with different shapes, different colors, the way the patterns intersect. So it's a great one to start with, but it's also a good one to play with and get some creativity going. So if you're ready, grab a pen and some paper, find somewhere comfy to sit down, and let's doodle. Okay, well I hope you're all ready to start the RADIATE pattern. I'm gonna show you a quick example of what it looks like. You can see here we have just a lot of lines that all converge into a single point. I do want to make sure you know on the back here you can see there was a good amount of bleed through as I do this. So where all of these points come together, you'll get some bleed through no matter what paper you're using. I promise it's gonna happen. So definitely make sure you have a piece of paper underneath to catch any of that so you don't go through onto either the page below or your countertop or whatever surface you're working on. So with that being said, I'm also going to use a piece of paper on top to go underneath my hand as I'm doodling. It keeps the skin oils off of this, my main page that I'm doodling on. I also end up rotating this quite a bit because I like drawing lines in one direction. So I'm going to be rotating this piece of paper quite a bit. And as I go with this, I'm just going to move my paper that my hand sits on with it. Now, as you do that, you want to make sure that the ink is dry anywhere you're moving it to. So be aware as you're moving this around the protective piece of paper around, that the ink on your doodle is dry, otherwise you're going to end up with smears, and that's never a fun thing. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that I like to do, and the first thing that you are going to do to start this doodle, is just draw a line. It can be anywhere on your paper. I generally kind of start in the middle somewhere, but you're just gonna draw a line. I start with a vertical line, and start off with lines that maybe are an inch long. You don't want to start with really long lines. The main reason for that is it's harder to draw straight lines the longer they are. So if this is your first time doing this doodle, I'd recommend maybe like an inch or so for your line length. You can always make it longer or shorter if you want to, but that's a good starting point. Now that you have this first line, you're just going to do another line, and you're going to join these two in what is going to be the center of your first pattern. So you can see we just have two lines. They're not parallel, they are converging into the same point. And you're just going to do this over and over and over again. Now I do want to point out, here you can see I had this line kind of bowed out and this one intersected it up here earlier. Don't worry if something like that happens, it does happen a lot. Not every line is going to be straight, and that's totally fine. So do your best to draw straight lines, but if they're not perfect, don't worry about it. It all kind of gets covered up in the end because you have so many lines. One that looks out of place is not a really big deal because you just don't even notice it in the final doodle. So you can see I'm rotating my paper as I go around here. We're getting a really good pool of ink in the middle of the doodle here, and that's where it's gonna bleed through eventually. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish up this first pattern, and then we'll show you the back side of the paper and see if it came through or not. Now another thing you wanna keep in mind as you're doing this is all of your lines should be moving in the same direction. In my case here, everything is moving from outside to in. You could also go from inside to out if you want to, and you won't end up with this big puddle of ink in the middle. Personally, I like the depth that the darker center gives me when I have a lot of ink sitting in the middle versus in the outside. Also with a shading ink like this, I'm going to have a lighter outside and a darker inside, not just from this puddle of ink, but also from the shading of the ink itself. So if I don't consistently draw from outside to in or from inside to out, I'm gonna have inconsistent shading, which will make your doodle look strange. It's not gonna not work, but I don't think it will look as good as it could. So definitely keep that in mind when you're doing these lines. Pick a direction and just stick with it. If you want to alternate, you know, one doodle or one pattern is going to be, you know, out to in and the other one from in to out, totally fine with that. But as long as each particular set or, you know, pattern itself is consistent, then you should be good to go. So that's my first one done here. Wow, I almost ran off the camera there. I tend to pull things towards me as I doodle, so I apologize if things start to kind of creep out of frame. I'll do my best to keep everything right here where you can see it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the back side of this. You can see the front, or actually I don't know if you can see, but there's still a lot of wet ink there. It's not gonna fall off or anything. Hey, it didn't actually bleed through. That's surprising. Some inks do more than others, some nibs do more than others. It'll probably happen at some point. So I don't feel safe. I'm gonna leave this piece of paper underneath it here and keep on going. So you can see this particular pattern, my first one that I drew is round. All the lines are the same length. It doesn't have to be this consistent. It doesn't have to be perfectly round if you don't want it to be. You can draw squares, you can draw random shapes. I'm gonna go ahead and start the next one, and I'm going to show you what I like to do. So you have your first pattern here. I think it really looks good when the patterns intersect with each other. So what I like to do is typically I will start where they intersect, and I'm gonna draw another one similar to this. Now my second one that I'm gonna draw, I'm not gonna make it as circular or as round. I'm gonna make it a little more irregular, but I'm gonna start here. This is where they intersect. And I'm gonna just start with some shorter lines. Now, you still have to choose a center point where everything's gonna intersect. But you can see, as it comes to this point, and I like to kind of do both sides so that my whole intersection is done. You can see that this side is going to be a lot shorter than my final line length, because you'll see in a little bit here, it looks like my circle just kind of got eaten up by this first one that I drew here. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going just like before, and now I can go ahead and go out to whatever line length I want to make this. I'm gonna, like I said, make these irregularly shaped. It's not going to all have the same length of lines. So I'm gonna make some a little bit shorter, like this. Gonna have this, see it kind of waves here. I'm gonna go back out. And you don't have to start at the where the shapes intersect. I like to do that, but you don't have to. If that seemed weird to you, you can start kind of on the outside and then let it come around to where it intersects. You can see as I'm doing these longer lines, they get a little bit more wavy. So that's why I recommended starting off with like 1-inch lines and you know, going from there. The longer lines are just a little harder to draw consistently straight, especially if you're just getting started. I've done this quite a bit, and so, you know, I do have a bit more practice than some people might. But even so, my lines are not always straight. They always have like a little bit of wave to them. But you can see this is gonna look a lot different from my first one here that was perfectly round, because I'm not making it consistently, I'm not making the lines consistently the same length. I do like to kind of have a little bit of not a pattern, but an idea of where the shape is headed. So it's like, you know, maybe it's gonna kind of do this wave thing. I don't want to just make one long, one short, one really long, one really short. I do like to have some shape to it still. It might just not be perfectly consistent all the way around. The other thing you might notice is I've gotten really kind of weird and messed up here. I started with this as my center point, but somehow this has become my center point. That happens if you're not paying attention, if you're talking or recording a video, watching TV, whatever the case may be, you're gonna end up with an inconsistent center that might drift over the course of your doodle. And that's actually not a big deal because you can have them all come back together. You can even do a little bit of coloring if you want to fill it in. Let's see if I can salvage this. Happens to the best of us. Get to talking, come up with something weird. There's always something that comes up when you're doodling where, you know, either it hasn't happened before or you just have to figure out how to work around it. And you can see here, I'm just gonna kind of fill that part in. Hey, no more mistake. All right, so that's my second pattern done. Kind of filled in a lot here. Another thing I want to point out is you can see we have kind of some open spaces here. If you want to go back and just kind of fill those in a little bit, you can do that, just so it's a little more of a solid center here. Now, I'm not sure if you can see in the video, this is still wet from before, so if I was moving this paper around, I would have to be really careful not to smear this. This is going to take a lot longer to dry because it has a lot more ink on it. But now we have two shapes down. We have an intersection where this shape intersected this first one that I drew, and hopefully you have something similar. Now, I do want to point out this spacing in here. I like to try and keep it a little bit fairly consistent. I don't want it to be too big, but I also don't want it to be like a zigzag between here. I like to kind of have a consistent spacing between where this shape stops and this shape stops. It's just a little gap that I leave in here. I definitely don't want them to touch. I think that would look really strange, but it also takes some practice to get that fairly consistent. So do your best. Leave a little bit of space in here between the two shapes so that you can tell them apart. Now at this point, you're just gonna keep drawing shapes. You can do another one here, another one here. You can keep going in this direction. You can come over here. Wherever you go, there's no wrong or right way to do it. One thing you can do at a certain point though is introduce a second color into your doodles if you'd like to. So I'm gonna do that here. We've got this blue color. I think a purple might go really well with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and swap out for a purple ink that I have here. And I actually like to cap this particular pen. Let's go ahead and draw another one. I'm gonna start right in here. And I think this one got pretty wild. I'm gonna kind of go somewhere between a perfect circle and this kind of super random shape. But again, I like to start where the intersect happens. I'm gonna draw a little bit longer of a line this time. This one was really short and I think that's what might have messed me up. But I'm gonna start right at this intersection point, come down here. All right, that's gonna work a lot better, I think. So we have giving ourselves some space in here between the two doodles. Okay, yeah, this is gonna work really well. One of the things I really enjoy about doodling with two different colors is finding complementary colors, colors that look good together and work well together. These I just kind of had inked up, so I didn't specifically choose them, but I do think they're gonna work pretty well together. But I do like to beforehand, look at my ink samples, my ink swatches, see what I have available, and find a couple of colors that might work really well and complement each other really well. So I have to be careful. This is still wet over here. So I definitely want to be aware when I'm running my hand across here that I keep it off of the paper, keep it up high enough that I'm not gonna smear anything over here. So I'm gonna go ahead and go in this opposite direction. I think that's probably where my intersection stops, so I'm just gonna not keep going to the same shape up here and start drawing this shape out on its own without regard to this previous one here. So you'll just keep doing this. Eventually, you'll make your way around. Okay, coming around to the end here, and I'm really not doing very good today with connecting to my original center point. I don't know what's going on, but as you can see from the previous one, and hopefully this one will work out the same way, it kind of all fills in, and you know, in the end, it's not really a big deal if they don't perfectly connect up. It's one of those where you get to color a little bit more, you get to fill in. It's all just going to be dark in the center there, so the original center point doesn't matter that much, and there that problem is fixed. But I did want to point out that that is something that happens fairly often if you're not paying too much attention. Now I want to make sure these are different lengths, so I want to either come back down and match this so that it looks fairly smooth. So as you get close to connecting one side of your doodle to the other, kind of be conscious of where you need to end up to keep it looking fairly smooth and consistent. So there we've added purple into this blue color. I think these two go really well together. I'm going to go ahead and do one more over here just for a little bit of symmetry, and come back once that's done and we'll look at some other options here. All right, I'm done with these 4 different patterns here. You can keep on going if you want to. I'm gonna go ahead and stop right here for now so I can show you some other options that you can do with this doodle. But this is one of those that you can see, it can just kind of keep radiating out. You can, if you want, if you saw my circles video, you can do another kind of standalone pattern out here so that it's not everything just kind of going underneath this one here. This was my first one that I drew, and if everything intersects with it, then it might look a little strange. So sometimes I like to do another just completely standalone one out here so that others will kind of start to go underneath and intersect with it as well. However you want to do it is up to you. 1 color, 2 color, 3 color, 4 color, multiple starting points, or just the one. It all works just fine. I do want to show you on the back side of this, we did get a little bit of bleed through, not as much as I usually do. I think it's because I was missing in some points and it wasn't all perfectly coming to the center, but it still did bleed through a little bit. So definitely make sure you're protecting the paper underneath your doodle so that you don't bleed through and ruin that one as well. All right, so now I want to go ahead and show you how this doodle works if I am to use a fine nib or a broad nib. Both of these are a little trickier to use than the mediums that I was using before, but can be doable. So let's go ahead and start with the broad. I think it is harder to use a broad nib for this particular doodle because the lines all start to touch and intersect at a certain point. So this is a platinum coarse, more like a double broad, but it'll give you a really good idea of how this works. So if I start out here, you can see it's looking pretty good, but the lines are so much bigger that they tend to intersect a little bit sooner if you do this like 1 inch starting line length. So you might want to make longer lines if you are going to use a broad nib. It doesn't necessarily make it go any faster, which a lot of doodles, a broad nib will speed things up a little bit, but in this one it doesn't really help. So I don't think there's a huge advantage to using a broad. It will make it maybe look a little chunkier. Maybe it'll speed things up because you don't have to draw quite as many lines. But in the grand scheme of things, I've tried it with the broad before, and I really think it's a lot harder than it needs to be. But you can see I'm moving pretty fast here. So if speed is your thing, try a broad, see if you like it. You might love it. Personally though, I have a harder time doing this particular pattern with a broad than I do with a medium. So we're just about to finish this one here. Almost running off the camera again, or off the screen. And we're just gonna finish it up. All right, so there's a broad. Worked pretty well. I mean, it's not too bad in the grand scheme of things. I do think it looks a little fatter and chunkier than this one. I just kind of like how fine this looks, or how, you know, it's a little more delicate, I guess is a word that I would use for it. So now that we've done a broad nib here, let's go ahead and use a fine nib and see how that works. So this is fairly wet. I also want to see, didn't come through, so that's good. For a fine nib, it's kind of the opposite problem that we have with the broad. It's almost too small. The lines are almost too small, and this is a fairly wet broad or a fine nib, so it might be a little bit more like a medium. But one of the things that I find when I'm using a fine nib for my handwriting, I also find when I'm doodling, it's that the lines just don't ever look as straight. Any little imperfection I think shows up when you're using a fine nib, and so I always find my lines look wavier, they look less perfect. So a fine nib for me, when I'm drawing a lot of straight lines, is not a good choice because it makes my lines look less perfect. And I'm definitely not one for perfection, but I also like to have, you know, if I can cheat a little bit, and I feel like with this broad nib, you know, things look really straight, even though I'm drawing the exact same lines pretty much as I am with this fine nib. With the fine, I feel like they look all wavy, like they're going all over the place. With the broad, I was able to you know, bang that out pretty quickly, and it looks pretty consistent. So the fine nib, I do think it takes a bit more work to make a full pattern because the lines are smaller. They also don't look as good in my opinion. So as I go around and finish this up here, I'm just gonna say medium is definitely my first choice as far as this particular pattern goes. I've always enjoyed doing it with the medium nib. Fine, I have tried before, and for the whole pattern, I think it's a lot. It's a little bit too much because it does actually make it take a bit longer, and I think it also looks a little bit wavy. Keeping your line length a bit smaller does help, but in the grand scheme of things, if I can choose a fine or medium or a broad, I'm pretty much gonna go with a broad nib every single time. Wait, I just said broad. I'm at medium. Fine and broad, not my first choice. I'm gonna go with medium. So I hope you found that helpful. Please definitely give this pattern a try. I do think it is a pretty easy and straightforward pattern. You don't need a lot of special skills. You don't need a lot of time. You can pick it up and put it down at any point. I would suggest finishing at least one of these circles at a time, so your ink in the middle stays wet. If you start and stop one of these at different points in time, it might look a little strange where the ink has dried at different rates, or you know, it's completely dry and then gets wet again. But other than that, you know, I could pick this up tomorrow, I could pick it up next week and just start adding in some more here. Maybe it'd be different colors of ink, maybe it'd be different pens, you never know. So definitely give this one a try. I think it's a fun one and great for anyone who has a pen. So happy doodling, and see you next time.